Thousands of Palestinians attempted to cross the Israel-Gaza border strip fence only to be met with live gunfire from the Israeli side. The deadly events left dozens of dead, but it also highlights just how much and simultaneously how little has changed over the years. I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. The Gaza Strip is a bleak piece of territory that no faction wants to take responsibility for, not even the Palestinian Authority. Most of the time, the international community prefers to ignore it until some incident forces the world to take note. The latest repetition of this cycle of violence occurred on May 14th, when thousands of Palestinians tried to storm the Gaza-Israel border fence. The Palestinian organizers, who referred to the series of protests as the Great March of Return, seek for the re-entry of their kin to what is now Israel. For the past 7 weeks, they have protested at 12 locations along the border fence separating Israel and the Gaza Strip. Israeli troops responded to the protesters by using non-lethal as well as excessive lethal force, such as drones that dropped tear gas and sharpshooters that fired live ammunition. Since the start of the events 7 weeks ago, the number of Palestinian casualties has mounted to well over 100. Some of them were members of militant groups and carried lethal weapons, still others were ordinary civilians who were deeply upset with the depreciating circumstances and just wanted to be there. Regardless of the details, human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and a leading Israeli body, immediately condemned the excessive use of force by the Israeli government and said that there was plenty of time to come up with alternative methods to contain the situation. Meanwhile, at the peak of the violence, some 60 kilometers to the northwest, American and Israeli officials celebrated the former relocation of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The split-screen moment captured the surreal geopolitics of the region, with Prime Minister Netanyahu calling it a great day for peace. Although President Trump's decision to move the embassy has certainly aggravated the level of unrest in the region, the blame for the current crisis falls on multiple factors. Foremost, Gaza is no ordinary piece of land. It is practically a large open-air prison, measuring at 365 square kilometers and home to nearly 2 million people. Gaza is one of the most crowded places on Earth. It is also in shortage of food, water, power, medicine, and other basic necessities. For instance, the tap water is undrinkable, and power outages usually last most of the day. As a result, hospitals are experiencing difficulty to function properly, and most people only have about 4 hours of access to electricity on a daily basis. There is also a shortage of schools, and nearly half of the residents in Gaza are unemployed. In addition, 45% of the children suffer from acute anemia, which is the result of malnourishment. Due to these miserable circumstances, about half of the residents have expressed no will to live. The blockade of the Gaza Strip is the catalyst of the region's despair. Israel, having withdrawn its troops in 2005, insists that it is not to blame, yet the Israeli government still retains control over Gaza's land, sea, and airspace to the north and east. It determines which goods get in and in which quantity. Israeli officials argue that these measures are necessary because Hamas, the militant group that controls the Gaza Strip, is likely to use the materials for the construction of rockets, bombs, and smuggling tunnels. Either way, the lack of freedom of movement means that people cannot leave the region even if they wanted to. Only a small number can leave for exceptional reasons. Neighboring Egypt also contributes to the despair in Gaza. The sole crossing point to the south has been practically closed for years due to security concerns in the Sinai Peninsula. Meanwhile, Hamas, which won the elections in 2006, has proven to be corrupt, incompetent, and oppressive. Last year, the group basically admitted that it's not up to the task of governing the Strip, and tried to concede the administrative tasks to Fatah as part of a reconciliation pact. The religious-based Hamas and the nationalist-based Fatah have been at odds for over a decade since the former expelled the latter from Gaza. Since then, Fatah has been restricted to the West Bank, but for the past few years the two factions have been trying to come to an agreement to unify the Palestinian Authority. Thus far, however, the deal has failed to bring about a working government because Hamas is not yet prepared to give up its weapons. In response, Fatah has withheld the salaries for civil servant employees in the Gaza Strip as a means to pressure Hamas into political concessions. At the same time, the Israeli side, led by the government of Netanyahu, rejects the idea of a Palestinian state and has encouraged the construction of settlements in the West Bank. With Israel's booming economy, it's hard to convince its leadership to change course. As such, Netanyahu prefers to manage the conflict rather than trying to solve it. Moreover, since the 2015 legislative elections, the Prime Minister has faced several predicaments, including criminal investigations and ministerial resignations. In February 2018, Israeli law enforcement agencies recommended that the Attorney General indict Netanyahu for multiple cases of corruption. Then, at the right moment, protests erupted in Iran, the situation in Gaza festered, and it seemed as if war with Lebanon was imminent. With so many conflicts in and around Israel, Netanyahu's diplomatic and military achievements complemented his image in domestic politics. So in Israel, whenever violence rises, people vote right. For nearly a decade, this status quo has allowed the Israeli government to keep Palestinian violence in check, and whenever a skirmish erupts, it damages Israel's international reputation, but not much more. All these political events, as well as the social-economic conditions, have placed Gaza on the point of eruption. What has changed recently is that the steady stream of financial aid has diminished. To clarify, even though much of the international community boycotts Hamas, hundreds of millions of dollars in humanitarian aid are still poured into Gaza annually. This is what essentially kept the region from total economic meltdown. But since the start of the year, foreign donors have substantially scaled back their financial aid to the area because there is just too little to show for. This includes the United States, which cut about $300 million in contributions for the UN Relief and Works Agency. Roughly 1 million residents in the Gaza Strip rely on this agency for assistance. Now, however, with depleted funds, the agency is unable to fulfill its tasks, which leaves half of the population in Gaza to fend for themselves. Since the reduction of international aid, Gaza has struggled with a shortage of cash. Subsequently, the purchasing power of Palestinians in the region has plummeted by half. In turn, this has forced people to seek credit wherever they can. However, the increasing level of debt has triggered a domino effect in the area, which has utterly crippled the local economy. So Gaza, as bad as it always was, is now in freefall. For Hamas, the recent border crisis is a means to divert attention away from the internal social-economic depreciation. None of this is going to kickstart the economy, but it does help to bolster the legitimacy of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. In addition, the Palestinian cause raises fundamental questions on a broader scale. An increasing number of regional governments are losing patience with the Palestinian crisis, particularly the Arab states, yet they also recognize the sentimental power of the topic among their respective citizens. As such, the Palestinian crisis represents an instrument to shift the attitudes of citizens and shape the electoral outcomes. It's also a means for governments to gain regional influence. How exactly regional powers exploit the Palestinian cause differs from state to state. Iran, for example, uses Hamas to undermine President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, who has kept Iranian influence in the West Bank in check. Ultimately, this strengthens Iran's hand in the area. Another state that uses the Palestinian question to enhance its role as the regional power is Turkey. In protest to the recent violence, the Israeli ambassador to Turkey was expelled from the country. In practice, however, the decision is due to the upcoming elections in Turkey, which is scheduled for June 2018. The ruling party hopes to use the crisis in Gaza to rally hesitant voters in their favor. Other powers, however, like Saudi Arabia, face a more complicated political reality. The Saudis condemned the use of force by Israel against Palestinian civilians, but government officials in Riyadh consider the actions of Iran a far more pressing issue. As such, Saudi policymakers must navigate between the traditional sentiments and the geopolitical necessity to forge better relations with Israel. Every state deals with the Palestinian question differently, but the recent crisis in Gaza highlights to what extent the Palestinian people have been abandoned by the world, even by their own leaders. Considering all these social, economic, and political circumstances, one thing is certain: there are no innocent actors. I have been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Credit goes to our top contributors for giving us the means to produce content like this. If you want to help us to remain independent and self-sustained, or if you're looking for additional perks, consider joining our community on patreon.com/Caspian Report. For now, thank you for your time and Sahol.